Wayward Clock Inn stood at the crossroads where three counties met, though no maps marked its location anymore. Sarah Chen's GPS had died 20 miles back, and the October rain had turned the mountain roads into rivers of mud. When the inn's crooked sign appeared through the downpour, illuminated by a single flickering bulb, she nearly wept with relief. The building sagged under the weight of neglect, its Victorian bones showing through peeling paint and broken shutters, but the warm light spilling from the ground floor windows promised shelter. And that was all Sarah needed after 12 hours of driving through the storm. The bell above the door rang with a sound like breaking glass as she pushed inside. The lobby was a museum of faded grandeur, moth-eaten velvet curtains, furniture draped in dust sheets, and a grandfather clock that dominated the far wall. Its face was cracked, the hands frozen at midnight. "You're lucky you found us," said a voice from behind the reception desk. The innkeeper was a woman of indeterminate age, her hair the color of old newspaper, and her dress a style that hadn't been fashionable for decades. "Most folks drive right past. Can't see us unless they're meant to." Sarah was too tired to parse the odd phrasing. She signed the leather-bound register with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion. The innkeeper, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Holloway, led her up a narrow staircase that groaned under their weight. "Your room's at the end of the hall," Mrs. Holloway said, handing over an iron key. "Breakfast is at 7. Don't mind the clock if you hear it. It keeps its own time." The room was clean but antiquated, with a 4-poster bed and heavy curtains that blocked out the storm. Sarah collapsed onto the mattress without even removing her shoes. She was asleep within minutes. The chiming woke her. 13 strikes, then 12, then 11. Sarah sat up, disoriented. The room was pitch black, the storm still raging outside. She fumbled for her phone. 3:17 a.m., but the chiming continued its backwards count. 10, 9, 8. She crept to the door and peered into the hallway. A thin line of light showed under the door at the far end, and the backwards chiming seemed to emanate from beyond it, against every instinct screaming at her to return to bed. Sarah found herself padding down the corridor. The door was ajar. Inside, she glimpsed Mrs. Holloway standing before a mirror, but her reflection was wrong. Where the innkeeper stood in a faded house dress, her reflection wore a wedding gown stained with something dark. The backwards chiming grew louder. 7, 6, 5. Mrs. Holloway turned, and Sarah saw that her eyes were completely white. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Not when the clock runs backwards. That's when they remember." "Remember what?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What happened when time stopped?" The chiming reached 0, and silence fell like a hammer blow. Then, from somewhere deep in the inn's bones, Sarah heard it, the sound of many voices screaming, cut short. The lights went out. In the darkness, Sarah felt rather than saw the walls beginning to shift. The inn was changing, reverting to something older, something that had been hidden beneath years of paint and plaster. She stumbled backward, her hands finding the corridor wall. It was wet and warm, pulsing like living tissue. A match flared. Mrs. Holloway stood in the doorway, her face illuminated from below. "Every night it counts back to the moment," she said. "October 15th, 1952, my wedding day, the day I locked them all in the dining room and set the fire." Sarah ran. Behind her, she could hear the incoming alive doors slamming, voices calling out in confusion, and then terror. The crackle of flames that cast no light. She crashed down the stairs, the geometry of the building shifting around her. Corridors appeared where walls should be. Stairs led up when they should lead down. The lobby had transformed into a ballroom, filled with dancers, frozen mid-step. Their faces were charred black, their formal wear reduced to ash that still somehow held its shape. At the center of it all stood the grandfather clock, its hands spinning wildly backward. "You can't leave." Mrs. Holloway's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "No one leaves until the clock stops running backwards. Until I've paid for what I've done." Sarah dodged between the frozen dancers, their burnt faces turning to follow her movement. She could smell smoke now, acrid and thick. The front door was just ahead, but as she reached for it, the handle turned to ash in her hand. The clock began to chime again, but forward this time. 1, 2, 3. With each strike, the dancers began to move, jerky and unnatural like marionettes. They reached for Sarah with blackened fingers, their mouths open in silent screams. She backed against the wall, which rippled like water at her touch. 4, 5, 6. The smoke was real now, pouring from cracks in the floorboards. Sarah's eyes streamed as she searched desperately for another exit. Through the haze, she saw a window, old glass, warped with age, but solid. She grabbed a chair and swung it with all her strength. The glass shattered, and cold rain poured in. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dove through, landing hard in the mud outside. Behind her, she could hear the clock reaching its 13th chime. When she looked back, the wayward clock in was nothing but a burnt ruin, long collapsed and overtaken by kudzu and rain. No warm lights, no Victorian grandeur, just blackened timbers and a stone chimney pointing at the sky like an accusing finger. Sarah's car was where she'd left it, keys still in the ignition. She drove without stopping until dawn. When she finally pulled into a gas station, the attendant gave her a strange look. "You all right, miss? You smell like smoke." It was only then that Sarah noticed the soot on her hands, the ash in her hair. In her pocket, she found the iron key Mrs. Holloway had given her. It was partially melted, the room number still visible, 1952. She would never forget the sight of the inn transforming, the way reality had bent and twisted around Mrs. Holloway's guilt. The backwards clock had been more than a timepiece. It was a scar in time itself, a wound that wouldn't heal. Every night, the inn relived its final moments, And every night, Mrs. Holloway stood witness to her crime. Years later, Sarah would search for the wayward clock in archives, in local histories. She found one mention, a brief newspaper item from October 16th, 1952. Fire at remote inn claims 17 lives. Proprietress among the dead. The article included a photograph of the inn in its prime. Standing on the front steps was a young woman in a house dress, smiling for the camera. The caption read, Mrs. Eleanor Holloway on her wedding day, hours before the tragedy. But the article was wrong about one thing. Mrs. Holloway hadn't died in the fire. She had become something else, something tethered to the ruins of her crime. Every night, when the clock ran backward, she opened the doors of an inn that existed in the spaces between past and present, welcoming travelers who were meant to witness her eternal penance. Sarah kept the melted key on her nightstand. Sometimes she would wake to find it warm to the touch, and she knew that somewhere, someone else was signing their name in that leather-bound register. Someone else was about to discover that guilt could burn so hot it warped reality itself. She tried to warn people, posting on travel forums and local message boards. But who would believe such a story? A backwards clock, burning dancers, an inn that existed and didn't exist simultaneously. Most dismissed her as a creative writer or someone suffering from trauma. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone would message her privately. Someone who had driven those mountain roads on a rainy October night. Someone who had heard the backwards chiming. Someone who had seen Mrs. Holloway's reflection wear a different dress than her body. They formed a small, quiet community of survivors, bound by an experience too strange to share with anyone else. Sometimes, on rainy October nights, Sarah still hears the backwards chiming. 13 strikes, then 12, then 11, and she knows that somewhere, at a crossroads unmarked on any map, the wayward clock inn is opening its doors again, waiting for the next traveler meant to witness what happens when time runs backward, when the past refuses to stay buried, when a woman's guilt takes the shape of a house that burns forever without being consumed. The clock is still counting. It will never stop counting. And Mrs. Holloway will never stop opening that door, welcoming guests to her eternal wedding reception, where the dancers are ash and the music is screaming, where checkout time comes only when the clock strikes 13 going forward, if you're lucky enough to hear it at all. Sarah has learned to live with the knowledge that somewhere between the tick and the talk, between midnight and the stroke of 13, there exists a place where time itself has gone mad, where a woman's remorse has become a living thing that feeds on witnesses, that needs fresh eyes to see what she has done, fresh souls to carry the weight of her confession out into the world. The wayward clock inn is waiting. It's always waiting, and its clock is always counting backwards, marking the hours until the next soul discovers that some sins are too heavy for time to carry away, that some guilt burns so hot it can warp the very fabric of reality, creating pockets where the past lives on, hungry and patient as a spider in its web. Check-in time is whenever you arrive. Checkout time is negotiable. And the clock keeps its own time, counting forever backward to the moment when love turned to madness, when a wedding became a funeral pyre, when Mrs. Eleanor Holloway discovered that some prisons are of our own making and some sentences last forever. In the end, Sarah understood that she had been allowed to leave not as an act of mercy, but as part of the punishment. She was meant to carry the story, to know that the inn was still out there, still counting backwards, still burning. She was Mrs. Holloway's confession, walking the world, bearing witness to a crime that time itself could not forgive. And on quiet nights, when she holds that melted key, she can still smell the smoke,